Okay, continuing chapter 4, we left off on page 31 of The Education of Oversoul 7 with Proteus. Twice he stopped to rest, gripping the thin railing with both hands and slipping his survival pack down on the stairs. At the same time, he kept thinking of his father, who must know of his disappearance by now. He was probably questioning Greg at this very moment. To show himself that he didn't really care, he started to run down the stairs, the echo of his steps growing even louder. Then the steps ended. A small door read, "Outlets, Surface." It opened automatically at his touch and closed behind him. A narrow hall lined with machinery ended with a second door. Proteus gulped. If he was right, he should be in one of the infrequently used atomic-powered sky elevators on the underside of the floating city, with nothing between him and Earth but 7 miles of empty space. He looked around at the small globular room in which he stood. He'd made it. The dials on the wall console told him he was in a sky elevator, but suppose he couldn't run it. Suddenly a whirring noise began, an odd droning. Proteus held his breath. His entrance must have activated the mechanism. Now, even now, his weight and dimensions were probably being fed into the mini computers in charge of descent. A red light flashed on. At the same time, 3 signs glowed into life: automatic drop, pause for instructions, and hold on, wait. The room itself began to vibrate softly. Proteus gulped again, pressed the button marked automatic drop, and closed his eyes as tightly as he could. His stomach lurched. His head snapped back. The sky elevator dropped out of its nest beneath the city and began its descent. Proteus's eyes flew open. Inside, the lights dimmed. A dial flashed 35,000 feet. The sight of it almost made him sick, as he realized that plans were one thing, and their realization was something quite different. Here he was 35,000 feet up in space, alone, falling steadily away from the only world he knew. One side of the sky elevator was a transparent window. He looked out, hardly believing what he saw. Bright emptiness stretched all around him. An endless blue sky through which he was descending. Then he looked down in terror, for below there were mountains of black gray clouds, heavy and threatening, like an ever-moving uneven floor upon which the sky elevator must surely crash. Despairingly he looked up to see the dark undersides of the city disappearing as he plunged further down. Could he make the sky elevator reverse itself in midair? He eyed the dials. No, he thought, even with the little he knew, he was sure that reversal was impossible. Now the dial read 30,000 feet. He looked down again, astonished, for as he approached the clouds, holes appeared in them as if by magic. He'd never seen clouds before, not natural ones, only the 3 tamed ones that went past with each 15-minute rain, but he knew about them academically. No film or account could begin to describe what they were really like, though, and involuntarily he shouted out with wonder as the sky elevator dropped through one of the cloud holes. He gasped. The clouds gave way, as if on purpose. The clouds knew? They're alive, he thought, like sky creatures. It seemed to him that they were rushing from all over the open sky to watch. Proteus stood, hands pressed against the window, transfixed. There were layers and layers of clouds. Again he thought of sky creatures, grazing. What did they think as they watched him plunge past? Then, suddenly, they thinned out, moved away, rushed past, away as if frightened. Once more he cried out involuntarily as the curve of the earth appeared, with the sun at one rim. splashing the most incredible rays of light that he'd ever seen or imagined. He's seen microfilms of sunsets, but they never even hinted at this shimmering vitality. He eyed the dial quickly and looked out again, fascinated. 20,000 feet, the ground, the surface of the earth suddenly emerged. Giant patches of color were visible, some dark, almost blue-black. Real shadows cast by the real sun. Some so brilliant that he could hardly look at them. His excitement grew as the skylevator dropped further down. The mountains were like gigantic teeth rising out of an open mouth. He was going to land in a perfect flat area, the floor of the mouth. He held his breath as the skylevator fell into the shadows below the horizon, and the ground came rushing up. Motion stopped. The skylevator landed. The door, impossibly, opened. A light blinked on. Waiting for instructions. 2 dials shone, one saying, "Keep on hold," and the other, "Automatic return." Proteus bit his lips. If only he dared set the control on hold, just in case. How good to know he could get back if he wanted to. Once the skylevator was gone, his connections with home were broken. But no, the skylevator mustn't be missed. His hand trembled, but he pushed the return button. Then he ran out as fast as he could, afraid that the vehicle might take off while he was still inside. He rushed out onto the small ramp, down the steps, and took his first step upon the ground. As he stood there, the skylevator shuddered, and 4 small rockets fired, sending their hungry flames outward. The skylevator lifted, wobbled slightly, and then slowly and surely began its steady rise. He felt as if he were losing everything. "Goodbye," he shouted. Then, resolutely, he turned away. At first glance, the scene before him was terrifying. Instinctively, Proteus looked up, but no plastic dome covered the real, harsh sky. Now that it was all above him, on top of him, not around him, it made him uneasy. The late sunset blazed across the rocky plains that reached into the distance, where they were finely ringed by high hills. The sun's brilliance hurt his eyes, but more than this, he was unprepared for the spectacular reaches of open space, in which he suddenly felt very small and vulnerable. He shivered. He'd never felt so unprotected in his life. He looked up again, this time in the opposite direction. The globular skylevator was rising, growing smaller and dearer each minute, looking now like a balloon. Soon he wouldn't be able to see it at all. Proteus watched, thinking of the floating city complex to which it would return. He sighed, realizing how snugly he had been held within that plastic bauble. Now he almost yearned for the skylevator's sheltering walls. Already his skin prickled. The air was wild here, not controlled, and even, surprisingly soft. Still, it pushed against his face, thrust itself all around him, pushed him, though gently. It felt alive. But then, so did the ground, which seemed to be a litter of sand granules and stones and small weeds. He was so surprised to be walking on an uneven surface that once he stopped dead still, almost afraid to go on. He wobbled when he walked. The stones hurt his feet, and he realized that in no time at all his shoes would be a complete loss. The sun fell a few notches in the sky. How many other human beings were on the earth? Suddenly he felt brave, heroic, caught up in a rush of exaltation. Once his mother had taken him on a business trip to the moon with her. But the moon was civilized and quite mundane in the domed areas. Earth was different. It was primitive, real. In a strange manner, he felt that he had come home. His aero skis would save his shoes and feet until he got used to walking on that surface. He inflated them and took off, whizzing just above the rocks and stones. But at once he was in trouble. Too late he realized that the skis had been developed for the comparatively even air currents inside the complexes. It was impossible to glide smoothly in this bumpy, undisciplined air. Trying to navigate, he looked down beneath him. So this was Section 7. The entire Earth's surface was designated by symbols now, though archaeologists and historians could rattle off the old names with ease. Still, he wished he knew the name for his landing place. It seemed sad not to know. He searched his mind, but all he could remember was the name Cyprus, which referred to an island. He thought, not a large body of land. Still, a name was a name, and better than none. His skis wobbled in a sudden eddy of air, but already he could tell that he was beginning to handle himself in the new air currents. He glided almost easily over a good-sized air hill and yelled down at the land, "I name you Cyprus." Just then he realized that the sun's rays were disappearing. While he didn't need a sheltered spot to put his small living nodule, the thought of staying out in that open area frightened him. Hopefully, he eyed the hills. If only he could reach them before night came, the real night, without the city's gentle illumination. He tried not to think of the ancient Earth night as he'd read of it in old records. For the first time he wondered how far the hills were in actual miles from Cyprus. End of chapter 4, to be continued. The Education of Oversoul 7. Thank you. Goodbye.